what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Elestrals video. Today, another strange one. So, I saw this on the Elestrals channel, where Swolax specifically got on a stream for 4 hours and talked about the fives dilemma. For anyone that did not watch that stream, highly recommend giving that a watch so you can get a little bit more information and develop your own opinion about this. I watched the entire stream. I have my own opinions about this, and that's what I'm discussing here. I'm going to basically delve into what Swolax was talking about in that video and talk about my personal opinion on whether or not this is a problem, and if it is a problem, how we can fix it. So, without further ado, I will very much recommend that you watch that. I'll put the link to that live stream in the description so you can go ahead and watch that. I don't know if he's going to be editing it down into a video. If he does, then I will link the video instead. But for the time being, there is a live stream that you can go ahead and watch. Siberian got on as well, gave his thoughts. He actually disagreed with a lot of what Swolax was saying. Then Distant Coder got on. Coder was agreeing with a lot of what Swolax is saying. This is a discussion. This is a discussion that we should be having because I feel like there is some disagreement among the fives. So, without further ado, let's get straight into it. So to start things off, what are fives? There's a couple of different things that can determine what a five is. There are like 3 different sort of criteria for it. A normal castable Elestral that has 5 or more in its stats. This isn't necessarily true. Obviously, we have Viscerus right here, who only has a 4. But it's a good starting point to understand sort of what a 5 is. More notably, it is a normal castable Elestral that immediately demands a response before things get out of hand. So just as an example, Viscerus, if you don't have an immediate response for Viscerus, Viscerus is going to get out of hand and you're going to need to do something about it. And then another criteria is a normal castable Elestral with an effect that immediately deals with a threat your opponent controls. Now, I do want to point out something about this. There is a bit of a caveat to this. This is not just an Elestral, for example, like Boom Bat. Boom Bat is not a 5. It can be played in 5s, but it's not itself a 5 simply because it itself has to blow itself up. So it's not only dealing with something your opponent controls, it's also dealing with something you control, which is not the criteria for a 5. So basically, it's a Elestral with a 5 in its stat block. It's an Elestral that immediately demands a response out of your opponent. Or it's an Elestral that a normal castable Elestral, so typically 1-cost Elestrals, but obviously Lavalith is a normal castable Elestral that immediately deals with a threat. For example, with Viscerus, that could be dealing with a guy. Sorlet, dealing with a guy. Lavalith, dealing with a rune. Ashrabbit isn't necessarily a card that... The other card here is obviously Ashrabbit. It's not necessarily a card that deals with a threat, but it does demand an immediate response before things get out of hand, because if your opponent is able to just constantly activate your Ashrabbit, they will get an immense amount of card advantage, and that's just not very good. So there are some more examples of 5s. Eddie, Ashrabbit, Rhynnymph, Brimlinx, Galaxy, Smoltuga, Nekruff, Mosstation. These are all 5s. The majority of these, with the exception of Eddie and Mosstation, have a 5 in its stat block, which is why they are 5s. Some of them have additional utilities. For example, Ashrabbit somewhat demands an immediate response, because if you don't respond to the Ashrabbit, they just get more card advantage. Or same thing as Smoltuga. Smoltuga almost immediately demands a response, because if you allow them to search for a fire, they can grab another 5, like an Ashrabbit or a Nekruff, and get off to the races. Eddie and Mosstation being the only Elestrals here with no 5s, well, Eddie immediately deals with a threat, and Mosstation technically is a 6 attacker because, I mean, its effect puts it up to 6 attacks, so it itself is also a 5. So what is the problem with 5? So like, what are the arguments that are coming out that people are saying against not only 5 Elestrals, but the 5's deck as a whole? The first thing, the deck is boring, right? It's just a deck that smacks a big guy in the field every single turn and wins that way. It doesn't do anything. It's nothing like going, for example, if you're playing Wind Burn, you can have a really cool play, Nexusing with an Exaltair from your Aeolus onto a Toxiswarm to burn your opponent for 3 off of just a single Nexus. That's really, really cool. Having the solar cards being able to foretell, that's really, really cool because it's something that isn't just big guy beatdown every single turn. And that is what 5s is. It's big guy beatdown. Not saying there's anything bad with big guy beatdown. It's just a boring deck is all. Because you just smack a guy, attack over them, pass turn. That's all the deck does. It doesn't do anything else other than that. It's also the most spirit efficient deck in the game. A 5's deck, typically on a given turn, will maybe at most use 3 spirits if they're going to basically activate, say, an Earthquake and then smack a guy. That's like 3 spirits, maybe 4 if the big guy they're smacking is a Lavalith. But typically, they're playing 1 or 2 spirits a turn. They play 1 spirit for the 5 and maybe 1 additional spirit for the like some removal spells or whatever. But a lot of the times you will just see them set a couple of cards, smack a guy down, and that's their turn. So they spend 1 spirit and they run over one of your guys. There are certain 5s as well that are gatekeeping other decks. A really, really good example of this is something like, what's it called? Lavalith, which is, for the most part, gatekeeping any deck that wants to run a Divine Rune. There's a reason why something like Wind Burn isn't super amazing right now. It's not a bad deck by any means, but it's certainly not amazing because it relies so heavily on Aeolus to the point where if you put that if you put down an Aeolus and your opponent has a Lavalith in hand, they summon that Lavalith, they hit your Aeolus, and you basically just get burned for maybe upwards of like 3 spirits. If you put all 5 spirits onto the Aeolus and use to the search, you're taking 3 spirits of damage because you're losing those 3 spirits that are on the remainder of the Aeolus. And potentially, but depending on what other spirit Elestral you have out on the board, you're taking even more damage because the Lavalith is just going to be able to run over your guy. So that is just like an example. And speaking of Lavalith, there are just some 5s that are just way, way, way overtuned. I have a couple here: Sorlet, Lavalith, Viscerus, Astrabbit. You might disagree with a couple of these. That's totally fine. I think for the most part, everyone agrees Lavalith is way too powerful. And some of these, maybe Astrabbit as well, some people might agree with me. You might be disagreeing with me on the Sorlet Viscerus thing because the 5's deck technically doesn't actually play these guys. They don't play Viscerus at all because Viscerus itself is actually not that spirit efficient. Same with Sorlet as well. They're not that spirit efficient. The difference, though, is that Sorlet and Viscerus not only pose an amazing offensive threat, they also pose an amazing defensive threat because they are still a 5 attacker. If you just stick them in attack, they also pose that defense. And they have utility to basically deal with anything your opponent has. Viscerus can just get way out of hand way too fast. Sorlet can just swap the position of anything. Which is why I'm saying these cards are way overtuned. The Lavalith and the Astrabbit, I don't really feel like I need to explain that one all that much. But I think there is something of note there with the way that some of these 5s have been designed. So let's just quickly go into a bit of an example as to basically what I'm talking about. Let's say your opponent goes turn 1, summon Sorlet, right? Let's just say they do that. How exactly are you going to be able to deal with this Sorlet? Okay, there's a couple of ways you can deal with this Sorlet. You can run out your own 5, so for example, Sorlet, and then just crash over it. Cool. You go 1 for 1 basically. Your Sorlet takes out their Sorlet. You both lose your Sorlets, and you both lose 1 spirit. The issue with this is that the Sorlet, you had to do that. Your opponent now is in a position where they can just run out a guy and attack you, and so you basically are losing 1 spirit one more spirit than your opponent every single time because they get the free hit on you. Another thing you can do, maybe, what about Boombat? Something like Boombat, right? An Elestral that can destroy another Elestral. Well, Boombat, for example, just as an example with Boom Bat, because it's the easiest one to go into, it requires you to do normal cast it and a disenchant from it. This is a little bit better than just crashing with the Sorlet because you don't enter the battle phase to do it, but it's the exact same thing. Your Boom Bat will go, their Sorlet will go, and on the very next turn, they'll be able to hit you. You've already used your normal cast on the Boom Bat, so you won't be able to put an additional Elestral on your field in order to... you won't be able to put an additional Elestral on your field in order to put some pressure because you've used your Boom Bat as your normal cast to get rid of their pressure, and then just going to put more pressure on you the very next turn. Okay, what about something like P-Gleam? P-Gleam is even better. When it receives one or more Solar, target an Elestral, set its base attack to 0 until the end phase. This puts their Solar on the 0, and the P-Gleam can attack over it, which, in this certain scenario, not only are you dealing with their threat, you get to keep your guy. This is even better, right? Well, the issue with this is that P-Gleam has 1 attack and only 2 defense. They will just be able to run out another 5 next turn and attack over the P-Gleam. And there's only so many P-Gleams that you can go through, but they have almost an infinite number of 5s that they can go through. So that's another part of the issue. Okay, but what if we use some removal spells? You know, basically Boom Bat, but in the form of runes, so that you don't use your normal cast. You can deal with the big threat and then get on the offensive. What about that? Well, the issue with both of these, first of all, resting on your laurels is not activatable in this board state because your opponent is only going to have a Sorlet. They don't play any Divine runes. They don't play any Stadium runes. They don't play any Artifact runes. So Sorlet, being the only card on field, resting on your laurels cannot be activated in this board state, and typically the 5's deck will only have 1 guy onto the field. And if you ever let them get 2 guys onto your field, and when you have nothing, yes, the laurels is activatable. You can deal with one of their guys, but how are you dealing with the other guy? Okay, but what about Earthquake? Well, Earthquake, yes, it deals with the threat, and you can go off to the races, hit over. You can deal with their big threat in Sorlet, and you can go off to the races and go in for a big push, right? The issue, Earthquake, is a 2-cost rune. It's not a 1-cost rune. Therefore, you are spending an additional spirit in order to deal with your opponent's Celestial, which makes it so that you are spending more spirits than your opponent just to deal with 1 threat that they'll be able to run out next turn. Okay, but what about we go counter rune style, right? I only have 2 on here, PTA and Shield of Achilles. I'll get into Gorgon's Gaze and Tsunami just real quick. Gorgon's Gaze does nothing to the 5s. It prevents them from attacking for 1 singular turn. It's not that amazing, and overall should not really be considered because all it does is basically prevent them from attacking for 1 specific turn and only. It doesn't do anything else other than that, so Gorgons is not a good card against the 5's matchup in a lot of scenarios. Against specifically Sora, if you're trying to prevent your opponent from like attacking over your guys, Gorgon just, for the most part, doesn't do anything because you're going, once again, 2 spirits down just to prevent their guy from attacking your 1 guy. You're going to have to deal with more 5s over the course of the game, so dealing with 1 threat at a time is not super amazing. Okay, what about Tsunami? Well, Tsunami swaps everything to defense position, but the issue is that 5s typically play a lot of their guys misenchanted with water to get around Tsunami specifically. The reason that they can do that is because the 5s typically don't actually really need their effects all that much. When's the last time you've really seen Nekruff enchanted with a fire? It doesn't happen all that often in the 5s deck. They usually just enchant a Nekruff with a water, so it's a 5 attacker that can get over your big body. Sorlet at the same time. We actually rarely nowadays see Sorlet enchanted with a wind. It's usually misenchanted with a water, so it doesn't get affected by Tsunami and all that. Okay, well, what are the 2 cards I have on the screen? These are probably the 2 most effective counter runes to deal with the 5. Shield of Achilles bounces it back to their hand, so it deals with their threat, and also protects you. The issue with this is also same thing. Not only does it only temporarily deal with the 5, it's a 2-for-1. You're spending 2 spirits to bounce their 1 cost back. PTA is probably the most effective way around. It's probably the most effective counter rune around dealing with a 5 because not only can you destroy it, it also reduces the attack by 2. So the thing about this is that it's similar to Shield where it only it's a 2-for-1 because you're spending an additional spirit at the end of the turn to destroy it, but you do get to keep your guy on the field, assuming that -2 attack actually meant something, and destroys the Elestral. It does not bounce it back to their hand, therefore you've permanently dealt with it. The issue with the PTA, though, is that there is a basically 100% certainty that they're going to have an additional 5 in hand for the very next turn to prevent that PTA from actually really doing its job. It's not like you deal with 1/5, you deal with all of them. No. If you only have so many PTAs to go through, you have to deal with them all that time. And if you're constantly two for 1ing the 5s, your opponent's just going to win very, very easily that way. The 5s deck is perfectly fine with just smacking a guy down, and if it gets outed, sure, guess what they're going to do next turn? They're just going to do it again. You've already spent more spirits than they have, so you're just going to do it again. That's all that's going to be. So what are the counter arguments to this? Basically, I've shown you guys some examples in certain cards that could deal with 5s, but potentially aren't the best against it because a lot of times you are still going negative in that. But what are the counter arguments to the 5s dilemma? Well, the main one, and this is actually something that I saw Siberian say, and this is where this point is coming from, just because a deck is spirit efficient doesn't mean it's oppressive, right? It just means that it's better than other decks. Siberian's argument here is 5s really a problem? Because how is 5s really a problem when it's just the best deck? It is just the best deck, so why would you... What is it really oppressive because it's the best deck? Or is it just people upset that 5s is the best deck because it's such a boring deck? His argument stems off the fact that just 5s is the best deck, right? So that's why it's winning a lot. It's just because it's better than anything, and that being spirit efficient is very helpful for it to be the best deck. Just because a deck is spirit efficient doesn't make it oppressive. It just makes it better. That's all his argument was. Other things, future sets can also very easily solve the problem. We are very, very early into Elestrals' lifespan. We only have 3 sets. The card pool is very limited. We don't know what's coming up. There could be a card in set 4 that completely solves everything that we have against 5s. And also, if just a few cards are hit, 5s actually becomes a lot better. Because if we're just able to hit some of the more overtuned and oppressive 5s, then the deck is actually fine, right? It's perfectly fine. Which, I'll be honest, I agree with all these points. I really do. And if this is your stance, cool. That's totally good. I'm happy that you're fine with this being a thing. In my personal opinion, I think that 5s is a little bit of a problem. Now, let's quickly talk about Thunder Nexus, right? So before Spark It was banned, 5s realistically was not seeing like any success anywhere. Why was this the case? Why was Spark It gatekeeping 5 out of the format? This is pretty simple, in my opinion. Spark It had targeted removal from the hand. This meant that Spark It, not only is it a 4 attacker, so if you Nexus onto it, and they always have basically a Mount Olympus up, and the 5 deck doesn't ever play a Stadium Rune, so you're just always able to have your Mount Olympus up. Spark It's basically always a 6 attacker, so the 5s can't attack over it. But Spark It also being able to discard a card from your opponent's hand means it can discard the problematic 5s that are in your opponent's hand. If you look at your hand, if you look at their hand and you see a Lavalith that could just completely ruin your day, Lavalith is the card that you're just ripping out of their hand. That is why 5s was not a super amazing deck before Spark It was banned, and why the moment Spark It got banned, 5s immediately became the best deck in the format. They were probably not even the second best deck. You could maybe even argue they weren't the 3rd best deck of not only base set, but Frostfall before Spark It got banned. Because Spark It was such a problem for 5s that if they ever went up against Thunder Nexus, it was almost a guaranteed win for Thunder Nexus. And that is sort of how it happened. Obviously, Thunder Nexus itself is also a boring deck, which is why Spark It got banned, but now we have another boring deck we have to deal with. And the solution to this boring deck is not as simple as banning 1 card, because there are multiple cards you have to hit. And I know for a fact that you not want to hit multiple cards in a single deck. However, there is a little bit to note there. What should be noted as well, though, not every single 5 is bad. I've kind of already alluded to this. Certain 5s are actually very, very well designed cards, in my opinion. Nekruff, Arrowmare, and Broomalinx are actually very, very good. Nekruff not only is it a one defender, its effect realistically isn't actually that oppressive. It destroys an Elestral in battle, burns you for an additional 1. Not only is that in theme with fire, it's overall not that like crazy of an effect. It's just in a single burn that happens once like every other turn. The Necrof itself, with only having one defense, is actually pretty easy to deal with. First of all, Cryoblast now here, so Necrof can just get immediately one-shotted by a Cryoblast, but also if you have a properly enchanted Necrof, you can just swap that sucker to defense position with a Tsunami and immediately attack over it with anything. So Necrof is actually not that bad. Arrowmare, it's a 4/5 Arrowmare. That has room to be really, really oppressive and really, really crazy. However, Arrowmare's effect just isn't that amazing. It doesn't do anything on the field. It only does something when it's ascended, when you send over it, which makes Arrowmare actually a very fair card because if you're just playing it for its stat line, 4/5, it doesn't do anything other than that. All it is a big guy that doesn't have an effect. It's a vanilla for the most part. And Broomlinx also was sort of a vanilla. It's a 3/5 that can Nexus 2 and shut down one rune while it's on the field. That's totally fine. If this card said pop a rune, I think that would be way too powerful, and it would just straight up be a better version of Equal Links because of the 5 defense rather than the 4 attack. It would just be straight up better. So I think for the most part, Broomlinx is actually a very, very well-designed 5. So my point here is that 5s can exist. They can. We've seen it. Necrof, Arrowmare, Broomlinx, they can exist in a very well-designed form. But some 5s are very, very overtuned, very, very overpowered. In my opinion, Viscerus, Sorlet, Lavalith, and Ashrabbit are like the biggest offenders to this. Sorlet, maybe not so much, but I think especially Lavalith and Ashrabbit are probably the most overtuned 5s currently in the game. The overtuned 5s immediately demand an answer, and even if they get answer for the most part, they did their job because they traded with a form of removal. For example, if you summon an Ashrabbit, right, and your opponent PTAs the Ashrabbit, not only does the Ashrabbit still get its effect off, you have to spend 2 additional spirits in order to destroy it. And even if it doesn't get its effect off, let's say they normal cast an Ashrabbit, you Gorgon's Gaze it, and then your next turn you hit it with a Earthquake. Not only did the Ashrabbit didn't get the effect off, but you spent 4 for 1. That is not good at all, and it's just what 5s wants. They want you to respond to their stuff so that not only do you have less counter runes, you spend more spirits. They want their stuff to basically be answered a lot of times because they just play their guy for the big stats. I think that is sort of like the idea. So it's the overtuned 5s that are the issue. There are some well-designed 5s though. And another thing to note, Ambrosia is a problem. I'm starting to really believe Ambrosia is a problem. Reason being, you can argue, if 5s are so spirit efficient, why not just play Ambrosia? Sure, yeah, that's fair. Every single deck, though, is playing 3 copies of Ambrosia just to deal with the spirit efficiency of 5s. The issue, 5s are also playing Ambrosia because they can. 5s can just go ahead and play 3 copies of Ambrosia to make themselves even more spirit efficient. So they're basically canceling out your Ambrosias just due to the fact that they are also playing Ambrosia. That's sort of like the idea. And it's why 5s are just seeing so much success. It's because they can also play Ambrosia, which allows them to be even more spirit efficient than they already are. So what's the solution for these? What are the solutions for these cards? There are a couple. There are 2 in my opinion. I'll talk about both of these. We give lower stated cards better effects and higher stated cards worse effects. So, for example, Arrowmare is a very good example of a well-designed card because, as I said before, it doesn't do anything on cast. It's just it doesn't do anything when it's on the field. It only does something when it leaves the field by a certain game mechanic, which is very, very fine. Arrowmare is a very, very good, well-designed 5. However, another thing to note is that take something like P-Gleam, for example, right? P-Gleam's effect to swap an opponent's Elestral's attack to 0, that can be good, and it is a lower stated Elestral, right? That can be very, very good. The issue is that it's not super amazing because typically you're only having that be activated on your turn. there isn't really much of a card. You could technically like Altar of Stars potentially to get the effect off again, but it's the same sort of dilemma we've had. You're dealing with the 5 for a single turn by spending additional spirits. By you swapping in a 5's attack to 0 that your opponent just casts on the whim, it only lasts until the end phase, so your opponent will not be able to actually attack into you, but at the end phase, their attack will go back to 5, and the P-Gleam once again will not be able to attack over it. So you have to then enchant another spirit to it, to then attack over it, and then that's just spending the same thing. Way too much spirits. You're spending way too many spirits. It's not, I guess, a terrible card to play into 5s, but it's certainly not the most spirit efficient card you could be playing. Another idea, which I haven't actually heard a whole lot of people talking about this, give archetypal healing tools that 5s can't use. We've seen this a little bit with stuff like Nemisail, Dratagwa, even Sluggle and Quackle, for examples. Yes, you could also argue Dratagwa was seen playing 5s before Daybreak came out, and that is true. The difference is, though, Dratagwa is a 4 defender. It itself is almost a 5, and for a lot of times it is essentially a 5. I think another way to fix that is just make Dratagwa a 3 defender, because then 5s wouldn't play it, and you would just have an archetypal water healing tool that can't be used by 5s. I think if we give one of these to every single element in the game that 5s can't use because they spend so many spirits of different types, I think that's a lot better. Now, I also have an idea that we'll get into a little bit later about potentially archetypal ambrosia. We'll get into that in just a couple of slides. But first, let's get into an idea. I was talking about P-Gleam. How could we potentially change P-Gleam's effect to make it so much better? Now, I don't know if this is a good idea. You guys let me know in the comments whether or not you think this is actually a good change to an effect. But its current effect reads, when this P-Gleam receives 1 or more solar, target an Elestral set its base attack to 0 until the end phase. Not bad, right? However, I say we change the effect to when you normal cast this P-Gleam, or when your opponent normal casts an Elestral, you can target an Elestral and set its base attack to 0 until the end phase. What this does is that it makes it so that on normal cast, it does the exact same thing as current P-Gleam, but you can also do this on your opponent's turn when they normal cast their own Elestral to essentially give it... this is actually a typo. I mistyped this. This should say, when your opponent normal casts an Elestral, you can target that Elestral. Not an Elestral, that Elestral. This basically makes it that every single time as long as P-Gleam's in the field, all of your opponent's Elestrals that they normal cast have summoning sickness. That's a good way to deal with 5s. Give their 5s summoning sickness. I think it's a whole lot better. So that is an idea for a potential fix to P-Gleam. Again, let me know if you guys like this change in the comments. And if you don't, maybe offer an additional solution to the effect. If you think the effect's totally fine as is, same thing. That's perfectly fine. I'm trying to get your guys' opinion while also give my opinion on the whole matter. So we talked about Ambrosia. How exactly can we fix Ambrosia? I have 2 different ways we can do it. I want to try to make Ambrosia a card that is healing that 5s can't use, right? So my first idea is return up to 3 spirits from the Underworld to your spirit deck. You can only activate this card, or I guess that should say, you can only activate this Ambrosia if your opponent has more spirits in their spirit deck than you. This makes it that you're only able to activate Ambrosia if you're currently behind. And I think that's a very, very interesting way to do it because 5s tend to not be lower on spirits than their opponents, so they will almost never be able to activate Ambrosia until maybe super late game if their opponent's able to get them down to 1 spirit. But at the same time, if they are down to 1 spirit, a lot of the times that 5s deck is looking a little rough if they're able to get them down that low. So I don't actually necessarily hate this, but I think I actually do have a better version of this card. This, in my opinion, is actually not that bad, but I think there's a better version of Ambrosia we'll get into. And it's the archetypal Ambrosia. Return up to 3 earth, wind, water, lunar, solar, thunder, whatever spirit you may be, whatever spirit you want to go with. Basically, it's the same thing as Ambrosia, but you're only allowed to return one specific elemental type from your Underworld to your spirit deck in one casting of the card. So, for example, if you cast Ambrosia, you can basically grab an earth, a wind, a water. You can grab one of each from your Underworld and put it back into your spirit deck. My solution is to make it so that when you activate Ambrosia, you are only allowed to grab up to 3 earths, up to 3 winds, up to 3 waters. You can't mix and match spirits. This makes it so that 5 are not able to use the Ambrosia super effectively because they're not allowed to mix and match what spirits they want to grab. This is very important because 5s, obviously, I think the deck that Jayak's deck, the deck that just won the last tournament, if I'm not mistaken, he was playing 6 different spirit types in a spirit deck, which, say what you will, that might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing. In my opinion, though, I feel like an archetypal Ambrosia to basically prevent the 5s deck from being able to access this super insane healing pool makes it less. The deck is still super spirit efficient, but it can't access a healing tool to make them even more spirit efficient. That's sort of the idea I'm getting at. I want to make it so that there is a generic healing spell for every single element in the game, so that the spirit efficient decks that aren't, say, 5s, sorry, the spirit efficient decks like 5s, I should say, can't utilize those healing spells to make them even more spirit efficient. That is sort of the idea. So, with all this being said, what do I think needs to change moving forward? My personal opinion is that every single element should be able to be used as a toolbox deck, utilizing the best cards from that element. Think Wind Toolbox from the first and second set. That's sort of like the idea I'm getting at. But instead of making it like only Wind Toolbox, Water Toolbox, Thunder Toolbox, Fire Toolbox, Earth Toolbox. Anything you want to do, make it a toolbox version of that element that utilizes the archetypal healing stuff, so that way a deck like 5s that utilizes them from outside, that utilizes a bunch of different spirits in the game rather than just being one primary element for your deck, can't utilize those healing spells nearly as effectively as the other toolbox decks in the game. However, within an element, I think you should be able to run a game plan that you can turbo for in order to differentiate yourself from the toolbox decks. Think Chronodile, think Celestleo. For example, for a Chronodile deck, you would be able to play a Chronodile deck that focuses on turboing out your Chronodile rather than it being a Water Toolbox deck. It can be a Water Toolbox deck that uses Chronodile in it, but I think in order to differentiate the toolbox decks from a deck that isn't really a toolbox deck, for example, I've seen a lot of Water Toolbox decks, quote unquote, utilize Chronodile as just sort of an end boss, right? However, I feel like, what about for the decks that are playing your Sundials, your Nomadiles, and then the Chronodiles to turbo out your Chronodile? That is a Chronodile deck. That is not a Water Toolbox deck. I personally believe that the deck representation at tournaments should be a mix of the toolbox decks and decks that are trying to turbo out a specific guy. Among some like other ones, maybe like Burn, for example. If you're playing, for example, Wind Burn, I think that could very easily fall into the context of like Wind Toolbox. I think if you're playing like Earth Burn, that is more so you playing basically Vesuvatuga deck. It's not Vesuvatuga because Vesuvatuga is not being played in that Burn deck, but it's just sort of an idea. In my opinion, I think, like, for example, 25% Chronodile, 25% Solar Toolbox, 12.5 Earth Toolbox, 12.5 Pharaoh Geist, 12.5 Fire Toolbox, 12.5 Celestleo. This is sort of the idea that I'm trying to get at. Make it so that there isn't just big beatdown deck. You can have a toolbox deck could be a big beatdown deck, but it's not a deck that is trying to utilize every single spirit in the game in order to get that beatdown strategy going. Again, this is all sort of in service to having the archetypal healing spells that I've alluded to. So what do I think needs to change a little bit into the future? I think there is a lot that actually needs to change in form of a ban list, and that is a couple of these cards. I think Ambrosia, Lavalith, and Astrabbit should be banned. And I think we should limit or semi-limit Viserys, Sorlet, or Eddie. We obviously don't really know what the sort of like ban limited, semi-limited, all that fun stuff is going to look like. They might do set rotation. We don't know what that's going to look like, but for the time being, I think they're leaning toward just having like your generic Yu-Gi-Oh ban list kind of thing. These are the cards that I think immediately need to go. And I'll go each of them one by one. Ambrosia, I sort of already talked about. There's an asterisk that I'll get to in just a second, but I do think Ambrosia in its current state is way too powerful and probably needs to go. Lavalith, this card is this needs to go. Lavalith is the card that is gatekeeping those divine decks out of the format. It realistically is. I guess you could also argue Earth Nexus is not being gatekept by Lavalith. The difference, though, is that Earth Nexus is sort of a deck that focuses on being Earth Nexus is sort of a flavor of fives in a sense. It's basically Earth fives to a certain extent because you're just utilizing your Viserys, your Demeter to buff up your guys so they can attack over fives, Mudlet to swap defenses, Equalinks to just pop runes, right? And all of this is in service of just being able to hit over your opponent's Elestrals. It's a different flavor that is, in my opinion, a lot better than normal fives, but it is, at the end of the day, still a version of fives. Which is why, also, I'm going to skip Astrabbit for a second, why I have Viserys limited. Not only do I think it's an overtuned 5, if we hit all the 5s decks, we need to deal with Earth Nexus at the same time. And in order to do that, I think limiting Viserys is actually not that bad. It gives him access to just one 5 guy that doesn't really... That doesn't really, like, proceed super unfairly down a rabbit hole of just constantly being able to summon out your Viseryses and get a boatload of attack. I think limiting Viserys, it does kill the point of the card, I will say, but I think just giving him one good 5 is not that bad. I think just having one generic Earth 5 is not that bad for the deck. I do think Viserys, at the very least, needs to be semi-limited so you can't just constantly be turboing it out. Sorla is another card I would like to see limited or semi-limited. I skipped over Astrabbit again. I don't know why I did that, but we'll get into Sorla and Eddie real quick. Sorla, I don't think this card is necessarily a super amazing 5. However, it's a card that is not only a great offensive threat, it's a great defensive threat, which you might be confused about when I'm saying great defensive threat when it only has one defense. The reason why I'm saying it's a great defensive threat is because during your opponent's turn, this card's going to be in attack position. So unless your opponent spends additional spirits in order to swap it to defense position, it's a good defensive threat, right? And that's exactly what Sorla is kind of going for. Sorla is one of those cards that you're basically telling your opponent, hey, if you want to deal with me, spend more spirits. You have to spend more spirits in order to deal with me. But throughout all of that, good offensive threat, good defensive threat, it's also a utility card. That is way too much for a card to have, to the point where I feel like Sorla should be limited. I don't expect Sorla to actually be hit. If I'm being entirely honest, I absolutely do not expect Sorla to be hit. But I do think that it should be at one point, unless we somehow find a way to deal with it. However, another card to note is if we hit Sorlet, there's basically a better version of Sorlet currently in the format, and Eddie. Why is Eddie better than Sorlet? It has one less attack and it only works on cast. You can't do it every other turn. Issue is that Sorlet needs to expend in order to activate its effects, so Sorlet is not a spirit efficient card. There's a reason the 5 deck is not really playing Sorlet, is because it's not spirit efficient. It requires you to spend an additional spirit in order to get its good effect off. Whereas Eddie just happens on cast and it can affect any Elestral. Sorlet does not affect the wind Elestrals. Eddie affects anything. And Eddie is basically an out to anything currently in the format, because there aren't really that many cards, say maybe like Lavalith, that have 6. There aren't that many normal castable cards, I should say, that have 4 or more attack and defense. It's like Lavalith, Arrowmare, and I think that's like it. I think those are the only 2. I guess the other lifts, like Arcolith, is also a part of that, but Arcolith is a part of a element that sees no play because Sparkit is banned. So I don't really think that's super amazing. But I do believe at the end of the day, whatever we do to Storlet, we need to do the exact same thing to Eddie. And I skipped over it, but Ashtrabbit, I think this is, as much as I love Ashtrabbit, I think it's time it goes. I think it's a very, very easy errata for an Ashtrabbit to come back, and I do believe Ashtrabbit is a good card to have. I think it's a very unique card and should be errata. It should have an Escape for Tartarus version of it, just like Sparkit's gonna get. And we'll get into that in just a second. But Ashtrabbit is certainly way too powerful of a card. Not only is it a 5, it gives you so much advantage, and your opponent can't see what on earth you're grabbing. So it's just way too much. Now let's quickly talk about Ambrosia. I do not believe Ambrosia should actually be hit until that same solution I was talking about before of, I say generic, that's a typo, archetypal healing is made. That's not a typo, my bad. We have to have a better solution to the generic healing. And in my opinion, don't have generic healing. I think, I realistically believe that Ambrosia should be archetypal. Or, once again, having that first errata that I proposed for Ambrosia, just making it so that you can only use it if your opponent is winning the game on spirits in the spirit deck. I think that is sort of the idea, right? And I think I really do believe that is sort of the way forward with generic healing, but I do personally believe archetypal healing is the better way to do it. However, I want to point out, I do not believe Ambrosia should be banned until that solution is found. Reason being, I think if we don't have any generic healing, because currently Ambrosia is the only generic healer in the game, I think if we have 0 generic healing, the game is much, much worse. It makes so many more decks so bad. It just sort of sucks that Ambrosia is an automatic 3-of in every single deck. I don't think it should be the case. I think every deck should have your automatic 3-of healing tool, but I do not believe it should be just Ambrosia. That is sort of the idea that I'm going for. However, with the additional 2 cards, we already talked about Ambrosia, ways to fix Ambrosia. What about Lavalith and Ashtrabbit? We obviously are seeing how we're doing the Escape from Tartarus thing. These cards would probably, if they got banned, receive an Escape for Tartarus print. So what exactly would that look like for them? Let's talk about Lavalith first. So how exactly would we fix Lavalith? I personally think it should be this way around. This Lavalith can be normal cast with 2 fire if an opponent has at least 3 or 4 more enchanting spirits than you do. I think 2 is way too small to get a big guy like this. The reason why it's kind of fine for Resting on Your Laurels is that Resting on Your Laurels is a rune. It's not a guy that sticks. It's a one-time thing for Resting on Your Laurels. I think Lavalith should be especially more because at the end of the day, if this card, you can still normal cast this card. You can just ascend over, say, a Necra, for example, and still normal cast it. I think that is fine. And if you do that, maybe the additional change that I proposed, which is make it a 5/5 rather than a 6/4, might be unnecessary. The only reason I'm saying 5/5 is because I feel like one of those has to happen. I think the fact that it is a 6 attacker is really, really annoying. And the reason why I'm proposing 5/5 is because all liths have to be 10 total stats. That's what we're kind of seeing with the lith line. So it has to be some form of 10 total stats. And I think 5/5 is the way to do it. It's not a super big defender. It's not a super big attacker. It's just sort of a Heliolith. And I think this would fix the card personally. Let me know what you guys think about this. However, I am very adamant about my fix to Ashtrabbit. I think there is one way to fix Ashtrabbit, and it's very, very easy. When this Ashtrabbit receives 1 or more Thunder, you can foretell 3, add 1 card that you foretold this way to your hand, and also make it 4 defender rather than a 5 defender. The only potential change that I could see being made to this proposal is rather than it being habits that it foretells, but it's a different kind of foretell where it foretells and then puts the remaining cards, either shuffles them back or puts them in the bottom of the deck in whatever order you want, rather than on the top of the deck. That might be a little bit better. At the same time, though, maybe it's a little worse. I don't know. Let me know what you think about my fixed Astrabbit. But this is sort of like the dilemma that we have with the fives. The deck is incredibly boring. There are a lot of fives that are way too oppressive. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done and a lot that can be done in future sets. Obviously, game is new. I still absolutely love this game. I'm not saying that I hate the game for the fact that fives just took down a tournament. I give all the props in the world to Jayak. I really wanted Earth Nexus to win that. Just because I think fives is a very boring deck, and I don't like fives at all. There's a reason I haven't uploaded a fives deck profile to this channel. It's because I don't like fives. I don't like playing fives. I think I like the decks that have that primary element to it, which is why that's basically every single deck that I have made thus far. However, I do believe there is room for improvement with the fives. And this is how I think we should be fixing it. This is my opinions. Again, let me know what you guys think down below. That's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure you slap the like button and subscribe for more. Hope to see all you guys in the next video. Goodbye.